I would like to thank the National Archives for the honor of inviting me to do this program. I'd also like to thank the National Archives for the fine work they do through all of their divisions, including presidential libraries, to collect, process, and make vital records available to researchers like me who want to write history that tells the truth and that's fairly accurate. I'd like to mention the names of two archivists, Edie Hedlund, who has worked in the National Archives, and Sarah Saunders Mitchell and her colleagues at the Carter Library, who have given me so much help, but also as symbolic of my thanks to all of those archivists all over the country who have worked so hard at the grassroots level to help the researcher who walks in off the streets and who asks for help. I chose the title for this presentation to be Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter, Peace and Human Rights. The book is entitled Power and Human Rights, but I chose this title because Jimmy Carter once said that if anybody remembered him 100 years from now, they hoped they would remember him for peace and human rights. And since I spent more than 30 years researching and writing on this book, I believe that when we look at the primary sources, we look at the long, distinguished career, the amazing career that they had as a couple, we will discover that he has rightly earned the legacy which he wants. That is a legacy for peace and human rights. Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter are an amazing couple. What they accomplished largely as a couple, which is unusual in presidential history. It also lasted for a long time. They've been married now 76 years, which is something of an accomplishment within itself, because they started out as just ordinary people who were ambitious, who were intelligent, and who took advantage of the opportunities that they had. What I want to do is to give you some examples of what I learned about the Carters that may not be common knowledge. Those of us who have lived through the Carter era have our opinions about them, how their policies might have affected our personal lives. But there's far more than that to learn about the Carters. When I started on this project, I intended just to write a short essay about Jimmy Carter as a writer. I was not disappointed. After one of the many things he did in his career was he wrote a large number of books. And sometimes I think I wrote a biography of a person who was a writer who also happened to be a president. The interesting thing about that, one of the first interesting things I learned when I went to the archives in the Presidential Library in Atlanta was that there was a vast collection of untouched primary sources. I decided that I would start with a clean slate, no preconceived notions about Jimmy Carter or Rosalynn Carter, and see where the primary sources led me. He always said that there was an equal partnership, but one doesn't get very deeply into the documents before one discovers they truly did have an equal partnership. Rosalynn Carter was not just an influence on her husband. She was an equal partner. She was involved in strategy sessions during the political campaigns. During the presidency, she did attend a few cabinet meetings, but she was also knowledgeable of most of the top-level decisions that he made, and often she was the last person he consulted with before he made his final decision. He took her opinion sometimes he did not, but she was definitely an equal partner. In order to know the Carters, one has to go to Plains, forget the tourist attractions, get off the main street, forget the tourist attractions, walk around the fields, the back streets, there are not many back streets, talk to people, and learn where they came from. They shared a religion, they shared family values, they shared a particular background. So, in the second place you have to go to get to know the Carters is, of course, to the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library in Atlanta, where there are millions of documents with lots of information about them. One of the first things I learned about Carter that may not be typical knowledge is that his nurturing parent was his father, Earl Carter. Earl Carter's own father was murdered when he was a child. He grew up fatherless, and he was determined that his own children would not be fatherless. So he took a hands-on approach to rearing his children. His firstborn child and son, Jimmy, he nicknamed Hotshot, which gives you a pretty good idea about what he expected from him. He was a tough disciplinarian. He expected perfection from Jimmy. If Jimmy delivered it, there was no reward. If Jimmy did not deliver it, there was punishment. That was precisely the persona that Carter grew up to have, and exactly the way he dealt with many people once he was president and in a position of power. We know a lot about Carter's religion, which was genuine. He was a compassionate Christian, practiced his religion. We know a lot about his mother, who was an egalitarian nurse who took care of black people as well as white people and spoke out. And of course, we know a lot about Rosalynn, a companion. As he said, he married the right woman. And I might add, she married the right man to produce the kind of couple who were so amazing in what they accomplished. They were in the Navy. They got married young, spent some time in the Navy. Carter, being from a Jim Crow small southern town, was amazed at what he saw in race relations as he was at Annapolis and later as a couple as they traveled around the country and around the world. His best friend at the academy was the only black person who was there at the time. And as he and Rosalynn looked back upon their background, they realized that the Jim Crow system in the South was unjust. And that became his template to attack injustice wherever he saw it, anywhere in the world. And he expanded that to the state, to the national, and eventually to the world level. So he goes home. The turning point in his life is 1953, when Mr. Earl died, and his mother, Lillian, told him he must come home to run the family business. The family business was not just a poor peanut farm. It was an agribusiness, which he and Rosalynn eventually developed into a major, prosperous agribusiness by the time he ran for the presidency in 1976. A bit bored, he read poetry. He looked for other things to do once he got back in Plains. He decided to run for politics. He ran for the state senate in 1962. Won it in a contested election, and where his opponent had sponsored all sorts of irregularities, including people in cemeteries voting. Once Carter, as a young senator, got to Atlanta, he and his buddies introduced an item of legislation which said that it would be illegal for anybody in Georgia to vote who had been dead for more than 3 years. He worked for racial equality, he worked for improvement in education more than anything during those years. From that vantage point, he decided he would run for governor. He went down in ignominious defeat in 1966 to the infamous Lester Maddox, who was well known for his racism. Carter said he would not lose again. In 1970, he ran for governor a second time, and this time he won. It was an interesting election, partly because Rosalynn had come into her own as a politician. She may have even been a better politician than he was. As she campaigned, she went out and met as many people as she possibly could. She gave the campaign a very personal touch. The big issue in 1970 in Georgia, of course, was still race relations, and Carter was cagey about it. He intended to improve race relations in Georgia, but his viewers could not really tell where he stood on most of the issues. He won in 1970, and at his inauguration, he said that the day for racial discrimination in Georgia is over. That landed him on the cover of Time magazine. That's what he meant. He meant what he said. He was a very courageous person. He meant what he said, and while he was governor, he was the person who did hang the portrait of Martin Luther King Jr. in the state capitol. And to keep it from being stolen, he had to post the Georgia Highway Patrol on either side of it on various occasions. He did other things. He promoted education. He was dealing with an energy crisis that was affecting the entire nation. So he did other things as well. In Georgia at that time, the state constitution said that a governor could not run for re-election. So he did not have to worry about being re-elected in Georgia. He wanted to move to a higher level, either in the Congress, and finally he decided that he would run for president. With Rosalynn's help and the help of others, Carter volunteered to be the workhorse for the Democratic Party in 1974. He and Rosalynn, Hamilton Jordan, and others of his primary assistants helped Democratic candidates all over the country get reelected, including some prominent senators such as Ted Kennedy. So by the time 1976 rolls around, Carter, who was relatively unknown, has gained a lot of power and control in the Democratic Party because he has all of these people who are indebted to him. So in 1976, when he starts his campaign, he and Rosalynn and their children and relatives go out separately from each other to try to meet as many different people as they can. Carter believed in personal campaigning and later in personal diplomacy. So when people go to the polls to vote, somebody said, "Oh yeah, I remember that pretty young woman from Georgia when she came to Iowa or wherever she went. She went everywhere to get people to vote." The result, of course, was that Carter won. They both won. The victory was for both Carter and Rosalynn, Jimmy and Rosalynn, because they had worked together so diligently to win in 1976. They ran against an incumbent Republican president, of course, Jerry Ford, who in a way, Jerry Ford and his family were much like the Carters, although they were Republicans, and they had to campaign against each other. Carter barely won the election. Carter was something of a political maverick. He could say very politically astute things, and then he could say something that could get him into a lot of trouble. Despite all of that, Jimmy and Rosalynn won in 1976. Carter earlier had said that his goal in life was to do as much good for as many people as possible for as long as possible. He said that was one reason he went into politics in the first place, because he could get in positions of power to do more good for more people and for as long as possible. And so that's what he and Rosalynn had been doing all of their lives. And now, when they're president and first lady, they have a much more powerful platform from which they can pursue their goals. When Rosalynn's press secretary asked her what she wanted to do as First Lady, she said, "I want to create a more caring world." Wow. The secretary didn't know how to respond to that because how do you create a more caring world? Well, Rosalynn had some good ideas about how to do it. She, of course, was a advocate of care for the mentally ill, challenged, and that was going to be her primary goal. But she did other things. But she did other things as well. At the inauguration, she wore the same gown she had worn when she was inaugurated First Lady of Georgia. And some of her critics then, some of the female journalists, said that Rosalynn was wearing a second-hand dress. The fact that she wore that gown and they marched down the street together, hand in hand, dressed as ordinary, well-dressed citizens might be, gave a good indication of what kind of people they intended to be in the White House. They hoped to be people, ordinary people, even though they were president, and even though they were president and First Lady. They intended to have a different kind of presidency. This slide is showing Jimmy Carter contemplating his presidency during his first days in office. They were not beholden to anyone, so they were pretty much free to do the things that they wanted to do. Carter was the kind of politician that he would do what he thought was right, even if it was not good for getting, political votes or getting reelected. So the things that he concentrated on with Rosalynn's help, he appointed more blacks, more women to high political positions, including judgeships, than all the previous presidents had done. He worked for equal opportunity, which gave a lot of courage and hope to many people in America who were struggling to find jobs and to be treated equally. He was a great advocate of protecting the environment, and he is the president who put solar panels on the White House roof and worked for alternatives to petroleum, especially foreign petroleum, as sources of energy. He set aside more acres of public lands to be preserved as national monuments and parks than all the previous presidents combined, including Teddy Roosevelt. Most of his work was in Alaska, where the land was still available to be preserved. So those were the things that he hoped to accomplish. Rosalynn had her own issues. She worked for mental health. She worked for care for children, for elderly. She was a prime mover in making sure that their young daughter Amy went to a public school. They acted like any ordinary family might act. And of course, Rosalynn was involved, as I have said earlier, in almost every presidential decision. She and Carter had lunch together in the Oval Office occasionally, where they did not discuss their children, but they did discuss matters of state. They had plenty of children to discuss. The Carters had 3 older sons who were born while they were in the Navy, and sometimes visible in their public lives, especially the second and third ones, and others, and the older son less so. Nevertheless, it was a large family with all the ups and downs that one would expect to occur in a large family. Carter said that he wanted human rights to be the basic, Carter said that he wanted human rights to be the basic element in his foreign policy. And he did that. Wherever he went on a diplomatic mission, or his Secretary of State or somebody went with him, he brought up the issue of human rights. Negotiating with the Soviet Union, for example, he might actually ask the Soviet leaders, now, will you release some of the Jewish dissidents that you have in concentration camps? He made it very personal. He believed in personal diplomacy. Sometimes he succeeded at that, and sometimes he did not. He did succeed, of course, in getting the SALT II treaty negotiated with the Soviet Union. He was willing to reach across the aisle to the Republicans to get legislation he wanted passed. The best example of that is the Panama Canal Treaties. Most of these things were highly controversial, but Carter had the political courage. To do so. Rosalynn was the first lady who created the office of First Lady. She created the office of First Lady with a staff of 22 people. She was a diplomat herself. She was the first lady to go on a major diplomatic mission to Latin America. She also went with Carter. The slide is that you're seeing now was taken in Nigeria, where she and Amy were there with Carter, and she was demonstrating the goals of their presidency. Rosalynn dressed well. She had a hairdresser and all of that. And she was also a good cook. She went to cooking schools. But she also said that she was not interested in talking about fashion and recipes. She wanted to talk about politics and economics and human welfare. And in her interviews, when she was with Carter, those are the topics she tended to bring up. She would also ask whoever she was addressing in any country how they treated their women, how they treated their children, what plans did they have to improve education. In other words, the theme of human rights was as much the first ladies as it was the presidents, and she probably made great inroads by giving it that kind of personal touch. Now, private lives were probably not that much different from any other couple, except they were famous and they were always in the limelight. They loved to go on vacations. They loved to dance. The slide you're looking at now shows them dancing together on the deck of the Delta Queen on the Mississippi River, which was one of their famous vacations that they took while they were president. Keeping private lives private for the president and first lady is very difficult. They tried to keep the ups and downs of their lives out of the public eye, and especially those of their children. Though Amy was the first child in the White House in a long time, and of course she attracted a lot of media attention. They didn't always agree. Carter said the secret to the long marriage was to marry the right woman, share the same faith, and several other things, which Rosalynn agreed with, but she always chirped up and added, and space. She had her own life. She had her own space, but she was still always there, a major part of the scene. Her press secretary, Mary Hort, likes to tell the story. One time when Rosalynn, as first lady, was in her office, she was talking on the telephone. She became increasingly irate with whoever she was talking with. Finally, she hung up the telephone, turned to Mary, and said, "I just hung up on Jimmy Carter, and I may never speak to him again." Luckily, she did speak to him again and continued her role as First Lady. The Carter presidency, of course, is celebrated for the Camp David Accords, the peace accords between Israel and Egypt. Rosalynn suggested the venue of Camp David for it, and she encouraged Carter to pursue it, even though he might fail. The Carters didn't really expect to fail, but they knew they were running a major risk in order to undertake such a negotiation. Carter turned out to be the right person in the right place to mediate the accords. Partly his belief in personal diplomacy. He learned everything possible about Sadat, Begin, their wives, before he met them. And he also had a knowledge of the Old Testament, which helped him get along, of course, with Begin, which was sometimes a challenge. Carter also told them to please bring their wives to Camp David. Of course, he would not be without Rosalynn, her comfort, her encouragement, her intelligence, and he expected if the other two, if Sadat and Begin brought their wives as well, that the chances of success would go up. They did that. And so Jihan Sadat and Elissa Begin were there much of the time. The slide is showing Rosalynn and Mrs. Begin at Gettysburg. We've seen lots of other pictures of that event, but rarely one showing the two first ladies. It's very significant because the first ladies, Rosalynn as first lady, did a lot of talking with the wives and convincing them on many occasions of what needed to be done. She got along easily with Jihan Sadat. And what people don't know about Camp David and all the stuff that we know about it is how important the wives were. You can't understand Camp David without reading Jihan Sadat's memoir, A Woman of Egypt. When Sadat was ready to give up and leave, she called him and said, "Don't do it. Wait, the Carters have been so nice to us." And he stayed. At the very last hour, Carter practiced his personal diplomacy. He had gotten the names of all of Begin's grandchildren. He had photographs of them, and he presented these to Begin, and he wanted the three men to sign them as souvenirs. It was very touching to Begin, and they agreed on the accords, went to the White House and initialed them. Still, there was going to be time before they actually signed the agreement, and it looked once in a while as if the whole process might break down. The current slide shows Jimmy and Rosalynn in Egypt. I believe they were on a train where they made an emergency trip to Egypt and to Israel to speak with Sadat and Begin to remind them of the agreement they had made at Camp David and urge them to follow through and come to Washington and sign the final agreement, which they did. One of Carter's diplomatic coups that is frequently overlooked is that he managed to negotiate the SALT treaty with the Soviet Union at the same time that he negotiated normalization of relations with China. This picture shows him in Vienna with Brezhnev right before they signed the SALT II agreement to reduce nuclear arms. It had been going on for a long time before Carter, but Carter picked it up, and reducing the nuclear weapons was one, of course, the big things that Carter wanted to do. What the Russians did not know is that Carter, with the help of his Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance, and especially the National Security Advisor, Brzezinski, was also trying to negotiate normalization of relations with China. Carter pulled it off. Brzezinski told the Russian ambassador 2 hours before they announced it that the U.S. would soon be announcing the normalization of relations with China. The Russian ambassador almost fainted. He was so shocked. He didn't know what was going on. What Carter had done, as he had restored a kind of balance of power among the big three nations, it was quite an accomplishment that he got very little credit for at the time. Carter, of course, continued to do what he thought was best. He succeeded in getting 75% of his legislation passed. He was handicapped by an international fuel crisis, which resulted in lines at the gas pumps in the U.S., which was very bad for votes. He was really limited by split in the Democratic Party when the powerful Kennedy family, led by Ted Kennedy, decided they would try to get the Democratic nomination away from him when he ran for re-election. The worst thing that happened to him, of course, which he managed quite gracefully and successfully, was the famous hostage crisis. And there was a revolution in Iran which succeeded in overthrowing the Shah and placing the Ayatollah Khomeini in power. Once that happened, Carter hoped to continue to have diplomatic relations with the new government, but it was almost impossible to do. The Shah, who was ill with terminal cancer, went into exile, and there was a lot of pressure on Carter to allow the Shah into the United States for medical care. Carter didn't want to do it because he thought it would lead to trouble. He finally yielded to pressure from David Rockefeller, where the Shah had most of his wealth deposited in Rockefeller's bank, and also pressure from Henry Kissinger, who thought that the U.S. owed it to the Shah, who was a long-time friend. When the Shah was admitted to the country for medical care, Carter made it clear, no politics involved, it was just medical care. The Iranians, of course, didn't believe that. They took the American diplomatic corps hostage and held them for the next 444 days. Carter immediately initiated a military rescue plan in secret. Nobody knew that it was going on for quite a long time. But more important, he immediately froze Iranian assets in banks in the U.S. and around the world, wherever the U.S. had any power to do so, bringing enormous economic pressure upon the Iranians to release the hostages. The Iranians said they would only release them if Carter would return the Shah and the Shah's wealth to Iran. Carter was in a bind because he knew if he returned the Shah, he knew that it would be fatal for the Shah and his family, and he couldn't trust them. He did tell the Iranians that if they he put them on the hostages on trial or abuse them in any way, the U.S. would consider that an act of war. All of this went on for a long time, and Carter's reputation, of course, began to go down as they moved into the 1980 election. The 1980 election pretty much hung on whether or not the Carter would get the hostages out before the election. He and the Republican candidate were running neck and neck. And that's when the infamous October surprise happened that the Carters knew nothing of at the time. It's worth a lot of detail in investigating the October surprise, and we are now just learning more and more about it. And that is that Republican operatives, maybe even the vice presidential candidate, certainly William Casey, went to Paris and elsewhere and met with representatives of Iran and told them, if you will hold the hostages until after the election, when Reagan is inaugurated, he will give you the weapons you need in your war against Iraq. And that's exactly the way it happened. The Iranians held the hostages. Carter went down in defeat. And Reagan kept his word after he became president. Immediately after he became president, there's lots of more research going on that right now as we speak, and I'm hopeful that more will happen. But I think it's safe for reputable historians to go ahead and confirm that indeed it did happen. The Carters went home to Plains not to lick their wounds. Rosalynn was very depressed. Carter consoled her. They sold their peanut warehouse. They wrote their memoirs and decided what to do next with their lives. They were relatively young. And so what they decided to do was to create two institutions, one of which is the Carter Center in Atlanta, which functioned a little bit like a private United Nations, but on a much smaller scale, where it promoted democracy, it promoted health, it promoted peace. Carter personally worked as a negotiator to settle disputes around the world. They attacked the guinea worm disease and were able to virtually eradicate it. I think the last count showed there are only 13 known cases still existing in the world. Rosalynn also promoted her same causes: care for the mentally challenged, education, health. At the Carter Center, Jimmy and Rosalynn were co-chairs. He was a chair and she co-chair. They were both co-chairs. They were equal, and they were still practiced personal diplomacy. They didn't send people just to monitor elections. They went themselves. They were there in person. They talked to the candidates. They counted that. They helped count the votes. They were very much hands-on. They began to get more and more recognition for what they did. And the current slide shows Bill Clinton when he presented them with the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1999, I think it was, which was powerful public recognition of what they had accomplished. Ultimately, he got the Nobel Prize. Ultimately, he got the Nobel Prize for what he, Rosalynn, and the Carter Center had done. As far as the general public was concerned, the primary thing that the Carters had done in their post-presidency was to work for Habitat for Humanity. Habitat for Humanity was based in South Georgia. It was started by Millard and Linda Fuller, whom the Carters knew. And Millard Fuller tried to get Carter to support it even while he was president. But after he had left the White House and was living at home in Plains again, the Carters got very interested in it. And so they joined Habitat for Humanity, which was a religion-based organization to build houses for the working poor. Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter donned their working uniforms and worked personally with the Habitat volunteers. They did this only 1 week out of the year, but it became the most famous thing they did, and they gave their name to it. So the organization became very large, very popular, and very successful, not only in the U.S., but around the world. The other 51 weeks they worked for the Carter Center and a parallel center that they founded called the Rosalynn Carter Institute for Caregiving. Rosalynn still has her own projects. They have the Carter Center in Atlanta, the Rosalynn Carter Center for Caregiving, established in Americus, Georgia, at their alma mater. As ex-president and ex-first lady, they had contacts with the best people they could get to help run these organizations. And today, the Carter Center in Atlanta is a very strong organization promoting peace and human rights. The Rosalynn Carter Institute for Caregiving is doing the same thing. By establishing those organizations, of course, they created institutions, strong institutions, that will go on when they can no longer be personally involved. It's a powerful legacy from an amazing couple who devoted their long lives to creating a more caring world. The day Carter won the Nobel Prize, it was 2002. The way he went to Oslo, after he went to Oslo and accepted it, he came back home to Atlanta to the Carter Center and went right to work. Right away, went right to work on the other projects that interested him. Both Jimmy and Rosalynn were writers. They wrote memoirs that were extremely important, that were good sellers. Carter's memoir, Keeping Faith, is not your typical presidential memoir. He wrote it with the help partly of a professional historian, Stephen Hartman, whom he had hired for the job, but he also based it upon a lot of the primary sources, a lot of the documents from his presidency, which incidentally were his personal property. He was the last president to own his papers. He gave them to the nation, but he was the last president actually to own them. So his presidential memoir is factual. Much of it is factual, and it's a wonderful source for information about his presidency. In the Carter Library, the staff secretary file is the most useful one because it tells us what Carter actually saw, what he commented on it. It also gives us inside information about what was said in private staff meetings. So we get a few off-camera comments from Carter. He was well known for his religion, his tolerance for all kinds of people. He liked to point out that the Camp David Accords were an agreement made by a Christian, a Jew, and a Muslim. But sometimes off camera, his temper would show. He would use his patience, and he would use some language on rare occasions that was not really a part of his public persona. He wrote many books. I'm going to mention only three. The first one I want to talk about is An Hour Before Daylight. It's a quintessential presidential memoir and a historical statement. What he talks about in that book is his childhood on the farm in Archery. His playmates were black. The nannies who took care of him were black. And he talks about what it was like to grow up in almost a pre-scientific age. He was born in 1924 in an isolated southern town. It's called An Hour Before Daylight because that's when the people on the farm got up and went to work. But he also called it An Hour Before Daylight because it's also right before the civil rights movement. It's right before the era when things were changing in the U.S., getting rid of the discrimination against African Americans, which, of course, he used as his jumping off place to promote human rights of all kinds all around the world. The second book I want to mention is a volume of poetry he wrote entitled, he brought out in the 90s, called Always a Reckoning and Other Poems. In poetic form, he talked a great deal about his father, Mr. Earl, the importance of Mr. Earl in his life. Always a reckoning. Mr. Earl wanted to know if, as a boy, Carter rode his pony, or as he did, or if the pony ever served any useful purpose on the farm. That's the way Carter was. He also, of course, talked about his about Rosalynn in great detail, how important she was in his long life. His mother, Rachel Clark, the African-American woman who virtually helped rearing. And the last poem, I think it's the last poem, is called Life on a Killer Submarine. Carter in the Navy, of course, worked for Admiral Rickover. He was on the cutting edge of the nuclear Navy. Actually, he was ready for his own command of a submarine when he resigned from the Navy and came home, when his mother told him to do so. Life on a Killer Submarine. He talks about the life under the sea that they might be able to hear in the submarine. And he wonders if a nearby Soviet submarine, if people on that submarine can hear the same thing. The point is that human beings are basically the same, and the best way to have peace and to promote human rights, is to have people identify with each other as human beings, which is the way he ran his diplomacy, and then you might achieve those worthwhile goals. The third book I want to talk about is the most controversial one he wrote, entitled Palestine Peace, Not Apartheid. Note there's no punctuation in the title of that book. It's Palestine Peace, Not Apartheid. It was highly controversial because of his use of the word apartheid, which was a very strong word to use because it reminded folks of the horrible racial problems that existed in South Africa. Carter went against advice, and he used the word anyway. One of the things that he worked hardest for was peace in the Mideast. His work there was highly controversial. He was not anti-Israel, and he was certainly not anti-Semitic, as he was accused. But his viewpoint was that Israel needed to respect the human rights of other people as well, especially the Palestinians who lived within their borders. Carter defended the book successfully, I would say, but he defended the book successfully, and he pretty much rose above the political and emotional comments. These are things that I talked about a good bit in both of my volumes, especially the second volume has a lot to do with the post-presidency, and hopefully it will lead to more research. The current slide you're seeing shows Jimmy and Rosalynn monitoring polls. That shows them monitoring polls in Liberia, I believe is where that one is taken. I like that slide because it shows them hands-on working to promote democracy, but I like it also because of the expression on their faces, especially Jimmy's face as he's watching Rosalynn. You see that in photograph after photograph of them, including some in the extreme old age, and the famous one where he had fallen, gashed his forehead, and they went to Nashville anyway to work on a habitat house. He has that same expression. He has his bandage, that same expression as they have on their work clothes, and they're getting ready to work on a habitat project in Nashville, Tennessee. This is the Carter Center in Atlanta, which is a very strong institution. It has a good many workers on site there, but it has literally thousands of volunteers around the world pursuing the goals of peace, health care, preventing disease, which is its purpose is for existing. This is a statue of Rosalynn Carter in front of the Rosalynn Carter Institute in Americus, Georgia, which she founded. It's a thriving and growing institution. She argued that every person at some times in his life is a caregiver or is a care receiver, and it's very important for people to understand how to get the care they need and also how to administer the care they need. And so it's a major part of her legacy. The books cover all of these things in detail. The two books together probably have about 1,000 pages. They have some good pictures for anybody who doesn't want to read all of that text. But the point I would like to make is that despite all the research I did, all the things I learned about the Carters, my hope for these books first is that they would present a more accurate picture of the Carters based upon primary sources, not upon what somebody's mortgage was or political debate. But I would like for the research to lead to more good research based upon primary sources to help us learn more and more about this amazing couple and their incredible legacy. I see a few questions. Let's see if I can. Okay. Yeah, I'll get to this one. I'm gonna start with the one about the recent New York Times article about the October surprise. Ben Barnes, former lieutenant governor of Texas, confessed that he had gone with John Connally to various Arabian capitals unknowingly to encourage Arabs to support Khomeini and the Iranians, to urge them to hold the hostages until after the election. I believe that that's another important detail that we need to know to help prove that the October surprise did happen. It also leads to far more research about it. Most of the people who researched it, including me, and even starting back with Giersik, who wrote the first book about it, did it sort of from the top down. We dealt with the top players and didn't get much down to the grassroots level. From what this New York Times article said, we can now start researching John Connally's papers, and maybe others who might have played an important role in it. I'd like to add, when the Iran-Contra scandal broke in the Reagan presidency and people began to investigate that, they discovered that the roots of it actually went back to 1980, to the 80 election, and some of the operatives in the Iran Contra scandal were actually Republican operatives in 1980, who worked to make sure that Carter did not get reelected. Yes, it's a major breakthrough, and I hope it will lead to others. Second question is, was the Shah as ill as Carter was led to believe? The answer to that is yes. He definitely was as ill as Carter was led to believe. He was terminally ill with some form of cancer, and of course that fact probably played on Carter's conscience as much as anything else, because Carter he was a great humanitarian, and in his mind, he admitted the Shah to the country for humanitarian reasons. Of course, considering the political environment, it wasn't going to stay that. The rest of the world, especially the Iranians, weren't going to believe that. But Carter certainly believed it. Carter was in a serious bind about the Shah. Carter had no use for the Shah at that point, because the Shah, of course, had caused him a great deal of trouble. But he was willing to risk his political reputation in order to save the Shah's life, to give the Shah the best help he could possibly give him, even perhaps risk the lives of the 52 hostages still held in Iran. The Shah, of course, went to Panama for a while, and then, of course, Sadat took him to Egypt, where he died. But the Shah's illness was certainly very, very real, and the Americans knew it. Let's see. I see one more question up here, maybe. What advice would you give young historians and researchers looking to utilize resources from libraries and archives and tell a story? Well, they need to take a good course in historiography, learning how to do research. At their local library, they need to go over to the library and adopt a reference librarian. Reference librarians are so important in learning how to use manuscripts, archives, what sources are available. And if they go to a presidential library, which they will have to do if they do presidential history, they will learn that working in a presidential library is quite a different experience. Presidential libraries are managed and operated under the auspices of the National Archives, but by professional archivists. And the first thing a researcher has to do is to learn how to use it. The archivist on site will be happy to teach you. When I first went to the Carter Library, I knew nothing about presidential libraries. The assistant director, Martin Elsie, took me into the office, and he was started to instruct me, which was supposed to take 2 to 5 minutes. An hour later, he was still trying to teach me how to use the library. And when he finished all of this, he said, I don't have any idea what you're going to do when you walk through those doors into the research room. I thought the man was remarkably perspective because I didn't have any idea either. But I knew that Jody Powell had been close to Carter, so I said I will start by looking at the Jody Powell file. And one thing led to another, and I learned how to use the presidential library, but I got help from some of the best archivists one could hope to meet in a presidential library. Learn how to do it. Don't take any preconceived notions. Don't go into historical research to prove something. Go into historical research to learn the truth about whatever is there. Historical truth is as elusive as any kind of truth. It's always changing as we find more documents, more things become available. Our research methods get to be improved. Technology has improved mightily, but still, see what you can learn. Don't start out to prove anything. Thank you, all of you who joined. Thank you for those questions. I hope that you or others who haven't sent me any questions will have other questions, and think about it and join with me and join with me in appreciating and being thankful for the historical record we have and for this incredible, amazing couple who have left us a legacy, not only of a more caring world, but a legacy, if we really studied, of how this generation and future generations might also learn to create a more caring world. Thank you.